This is the lecture on Catholic Reformations, and I'll begin with a prayer from Teresa of Avila. Lord, grant that I may always allow myself to be guided by you, always follow your plans, and perfectly accomplish your holy will. Grant that in all things, great and small, today and all the days of my life, I may do whatever you require of me. Help me respond to the slightest prompting of your grace, so that I may be your trustworthy instrument for your honor. May your will be done in time and in eternity, by me, in me, and through me. Amen. We pick up where we left off with the situation in England. In a shock for the Reformation, Edward VI died in 1553. Making his sister Mary, who was Catholic because she was the daughter of Henry's first wife, Catherine, who he had divorced at the beginning of the Reformation in England. And Mary proceeded to marry Charles V's son, Philip of Spain, and return England into the Catholic fold. Interestingly, Cardinal Pole, who you may recall was a Catholic reformer, became Archbishop of Canterbury and attempted to launch a Catholic Reformation. It was a time of intense persecution for Protestants in England. Hundreds fled to Europe, where they established refugee churches in places like Geneva and Zurich. But many others were burned at the stake, including Archbishop Cranmer, who had led the English Reformation under both Henry and Edward, and had been the author of the Book of Common Prayer. Mary killed nearly 300 people in a 5-year period, winning the nickname Bloody Mary. But it was significant that so many of these exiles went to the continent, because there, in European cities, they continued the debates of the English Reformation, debates that would greatly shape the English Church. At the heart of the debate was John Calvin's principle, later known as the regulative principle, which was that in worship, Christians could only do what God commanded in his word. And the question was, how rigorously should this principle be applied? Calvin applied it austerely but not dogmatically, while others, like Knox, were less compromising. They were much more strict. And as you'll see, this debate will play out in the future of the English Reformed Church. Meanwhile, Knox and others became ever more aggressive in their denunciations of Mary, and even calls for resistance against her. Knox infamously wrote his first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women, in which he argued that it was against nature for women to rule. This really frustrated Calvin, because he knew that Protestant hopes in England were pinned on Mary's half-sister Elizabeth. So he saw Knox's writing as very short-sighted, because if you prove that women shouldn't rule, then what are you going to do when a Protestant woman comes to the throne? Meanwhile, in 1555, a conservative authoritarian named Gian Pietro Carafa was elected as Pope Paul IV. And Carafa was somewhat of a nasty character. He had a long list of those he despised in addition to Protestants. They included Jews. They included the Habsburg family that ruled the Holy Roman Empire in Spain. They included the Society of Jesus and any sort of humanist-minded reform, including the group of moderate reformers that Cardinal Pole was part of. And Paul IV fought Catholics as much as Protestants. He established and strengthened the Roman Inquisition. He issued the first Catholic-wide index of forbidden books, banned for Catholics to read, and he spurred a wave of arrests. He tried to summon even Cardinal Pole, the English Archbishop, to Italy for a heresy trial, though Queen Mary wouldn't let Pole go. And he crushed what was left of Protestantism in Italy. He also infamously confined the Jews in the Papal States to ghettos and made them wear yellow hats, the sort of thing that we associate with Nazi racism much later. When he died in 1559, the cardinals were eager to choose a very different man, Pius IV, as his successor, and thankfully Pius reversed some of Paul's policies. In Spain, the Inquisition was even more brutal. The Spanish Inquisition continued its major crackdown against reform-minded groups in the late 1550s, leading to the beginning of what is known as the Black Legend of Spain, a legend of notorious Spanish brutality that would be applied to both what the Spanish Inquisition did in Spain and later in the Netherlands, but also the way the Spanish treated the natives in America. At this time, Charles V, who was technically emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and Spain, decided to retire, and he divided his realm, giving Spain, the Netherlands, and the overseas empire to his son Philip II, and giving the Holy Roman Empire and the core Habsburg lands in Central Europe to his brother Ferdinand. Philip, who now inherits the Spanish Empire and Spain itself, saw himself as called by God to be the great champion of the Catholic faith. And this is Philip. Under his reign, Spain became even more ruthless against dissent, and Philip himself even attended occasions when Lutherans were burned at the stake. Now, a Dominican named Bartolome Carranza had written a catechism for the Catholic Reformation of England, and he became the Archbishop of Toledo in Spain, where he again tried to launch a program of Catholic reform. But the Spanish Inquisition decided that he was too willing to engage Protestants, and he was arrested. He spent almost the rest of his life, 17 years, in prison. And later, ironically, when the Council of Trent adopted his catechism, adapting it slightly as the official catechism of the Catholic Church, Spain still rejected it, which shows just how anti-reform Spain was. There were other Catholic reformers in Spain at this time, including Teresa of Avila, a Carmelite nun who came from a converso family. So this is a family of Jewish background that had converted to Christianity. She experienced visions, which she wrote down, describing her encounters with God in mystical and intimate language, often drawn from the Song of Songs. And although the Spanish Inquisition was suspicious of her, she won the loyalty of key authorities and devoted herself to the reform of the Carmelite order. She called them back to their original poverty, and so her followers became known for going about barefoot, or descalced was the word, and they rejected all distinctions of rank. And here is a picture of Teresa of Avila. Teresa formed a close bond with John of the Cross, who was also a converso, but he came from a much poorer background than Teresa. At first, he devoted himself to silence and solitude, but Teresa persuaded him to become involved in reforming the male branch of the Carmelite houses. He too received strong opposition, including a 9-month prison sentence. And this led him to describe his experiences of suffering, writing a famous document known as The Dark Night. He also described his experience of God in intimate terms, with himself as the bride and the lover of Christ. And both Teresa and John of the Cross left a big impact on Spanish Catholic piety, even though they were often persecuted in their own lifetime. Teresa eventually became the patron saint of Spain, and John of the Cross was also canonized. Now, it was around this time that the Catholic Church summoned the third session of the Council of Trent. And unlike previous sessions, which focused on doctrine, this one focused on launching a program of reform in the structure and ministry of the church. Far more bishops attended this session than the previous ones, about 200 in all. So whereas previous sessions of the council were more about condemning aspects of Protestantism, this one was more about genuine reform within the Catholic Church. A central debate that took place at the council concerned the authority of bishops. Did their authority come directly from Christ, or did they come from the Pope? The council worked out a compromise, but after Trent, the trend would definitely be toward locating the source of the power of bishops in the Pope. The council also promulgated a body of decrees and canons about the reformation of church life. In 1566, it issued a catechism based on the one written by Carranza, which Spain rejected. In 1570, it issued the Missal, a single rite for the Mass to be followed everywhere. And this was another moment of Rome sort of tightening up. In the past, the Mass could be celebrated in many different ways, many different kinds of liturgical approaches, but now there would be one single rite for the Mass. These reforms became the new reform program of the Catholic Church, but they were applied in different ways depending on local authorities. But it's really this third session of the Council of Trent that created or led to many of the aspects of the modern Catholic Church as we know it. And there were several new characteristics that are worth noting. Just like Calvinist Protestants who were focused on church discipline, so this third session of Trent sought a reformation of manners, as it was called, the discipline of society, both clergy and lay, in accord with Christian principles. In other words, even the Catholic Church was saying, we need to get people actually following Christianity. It's not enough for them to just come and take the sacraments and be in worship once in a while. They need to live like Christians. And this signaled a major cultural shift in Europe. There was new attention paid to sexual immorality and to enforcing the celibacy of the clergy. Resources were devoted to caring for the needs of the poor, both material and spiritual. And increasingly, care for the poor was turned over to religious orders. There was also a widespread interest in finding and punishing witches, and this is where you begin to see the infamous witch hunts in early modern Europe. There was a new emphasis on the obligation of clergy to preach, to catechize, and care for the souls of their parishioners. Before this time, preaching had been considered the task of specialized clergy, such as the various orders, and care for souls had been seen as the task of friars. But now, the Catholic Church emphasized that all priests should be preaching. This was also the time when the confessional booth came in to encourage a more widespread practice of confession. And whereas Protestants tended to criticize the Church's ostentatious worship, the Catholic Church now embraced that as a badge of pride against the austere Reformed. And it tried to instill among the Catholic faithful a love for Catholic liturgy and Catholic piety and Catholic practices. It was at this time that the Rosary, including the Hail Mary, emerged, which had emerged during the 15th century. It was at this time, though, that it was pushed as a central part of Catholic piety. And Mariology, or the veneration of Mary, rose to new heights. So the version of Catholic reform we're seeing here is not a Protestant type version, though it picks up certain emphases from Protestantism, such as preaching and discipline, but it's very much with a Catholic emphasis on historic Catholic forms of worship and so forth. There was also a lot of attention paid to reforming and strengthening various orders, building churches, and promoting local shrines and holy relics. Thousands of bones were shipped all over Europe from the newly discovered catacombs in Rome. And by the way, this is an image of a medieval service, or not medieval, but an early modern Catholic service, where a Catholic priest is preaching to the people. There was also an aggressive, though largely ineffective, approach to banning forbidden books, led by the Catholic theologian Robert Bellarmine. Among banned books were vernacular Bibles, so Bibles in the ordinary language of the common people, which had been banned in English circles for a long time, but were now banned in other places as well. One pope even said that the more people read the Bible, the less Catholic they were. Also after Trent, the Jesuits, who you'll recall were founded by Ignatius Loyola and Francis Xavier, became a militantly anti-Protestant organization, devoted to doing whatever was necessary to promote the reforms of Trent and combat Protestantism. Their main focus was on educating the children of elite Europeans, and they hoped that by doing this, they would win the future generations of European leaders. They alienated Protestants and moderate Catholics alike by their intensity. In fact, from this point forward, within the Catholic Church, you can see two types of Catholics competing for influence. On the one hand, you had those who were militantly anti-Protestant, who supported the reforms of Trent, and who advocated growing papal control over the church. These were often referred to as ultramontanes. On the other hand were those who wanted more accommodation or toleration toward Protestants, and who supported traditional Catholicism, and who defended the right of local authorities to govern the church and order it as they saw fit.